So, of all the cities represented in the North American context, LA probably represents the most urgent gap in the diaspora for us to move towards mobilizing and pointing people towards that gap. So, in this episode, Kyle Pierson and our friend Tim Hutchinson are going to join us and share about the needs and the opportunities in reaching and going after the target that is LA. Tim, why don't you jump in first by just telling us your story?
Yeah, so I grew up in Michigan, and grew up in a Christian home, and felt like, man, if I was going to be a solid believer, then I need to go to Bible college. That was what was modeled for me. So went to Bible college, and when I was at Bible college, I was studying ministry degree, and had an opportunity to go on a mission trip right before I was about to graduate. And on this mission trip, it really changed my life. Here I was as a student with a theology degree, ministry degree, about to graduate. And I went on this mission trip to Cuba, and really didn't know much about the mission trip. They didn't really advertise the mission trip very well, but I was like, man, Cuba sounds kind of fun. Like, let's go to Cuba, see some old cars, and check out that country. And so when we got there, our leader was like, this is an evangelism mission trip. And I was like, man, if I would have known as an evangelism mission trip, there's no way I would have gone on this trip. So when we got there, we just started going out into the cities. Almost looked like villages as far as these homes were in Cuba. And one of the guys that we were connected with asked me a question that forever changed my life. He said, Tim, how do you share the gospel with people in the US? And it was in that moment, here I was, grew up in church, went to all the Sunday schools, was involved in all the ministries in church, went to Bible college, and about to graduate with some ministry degrees. And I had no response for him because I had never shared the gospel with anybody in my life before. And so, man, the Lord really used that to convict me about, what my identity was in following Jesus.
How old were you when that happened?
I would have been 21. Yeah. So after that, moved to Oklahoma, in the Tulsa area, and was on staff at this awesome church. Really had a heart for missions. And so my wife and I, we were serving there a couple years, and we always wanted to do missions in some capacity. And our experience with missions growing up was Central and South American type mission trips. And so we just figured, hey, we would probably do something like that as well in our future. And then we got connected with this organization down in Houston, where they were specifically working with unreached people groups. And that was the first time. And so my wife and I, we were like, yeah, let's take our youth group down here. We'll give them the good old mission trip experience. And God really opened our eyes to the need of reaching unreached people groups. I had no idea that there were people across the world who had never heard the gospel. Not only that God was bringing those people here to the States as well. They were our neighbors. They were living amongst us. And so, anyway, when we got exposed to that, my wife and I, we were like, man, this is exactly what God's calling us to do. And so we had an opportunity to come out to California. I guess that would have been about 6 years ago now, to specifically start a team to work with unreached people groups.
So you guys are in LA now, right? Working with unreached people groups. 6 years in, what's the biggest lesson, the biggest takeaway that you have learned so far about trying to engage UPGs in a mega city?
Yeah, and so our contacts, we're a little bit south of LA, but we're in the LA metro area in Orange County. But man, the biggest lesson is probably the importance of relying on the Holy Spirit in this work. I don't know. I think maybe growing up in the church and maybe in the West, I think there's a lot of things that we can we can do on our own power, maybe, if that makes sense. Like we can create these programs, we can create things of our own strength, whether they have, spiritual impact or not, may not be there. But for me, since living here, it's like, man, these people they're not only they not only don't know about Jesus, but several of them are actively opposed to who Jesus is. They're opposed to the concept of making Jesus the king of their life. And so seeing the importance of the Holy Spirit's supernatural power in the work has been something that maybe I didn't fully expect when moving out here.
Yeah. And so I know Kyle was putting up on a group that we're all in on Signal about just the different targets, or maybe you were putting that up, Tim, of all the different the numbers of unreached peoples in your area. That could feel overwhelming, just all of those numbers and all of those gaps. How are you processing that, and where have you started? Where are you focusing in the middle of all that at this point?
Yeah, great question. I think when we first moved here, it was like any person that looked or came from an unreached people group were like, man, we're like targeting those people. And when you think about LA metro area, there's over 300 people groups here, over 300 languages represented here in the LA metro area. And so I think when we first moved here, we were a little bit sporadic in our target. I don't think we really necessarily had a clear target. So I would say maybe over the last 2 years, and even Kyle has really helped us in this, is like, let's define what our target is. Yes, we're reaching unreached people groups, but let's be a little bit specific. What are the biggest gaps here in LA metro area? Like what's the biggest need here? And so specifically for our local team is, we feel like probably the 4 or 5 people groups that we're working with are Afghans, Indians, and I think Indians includes, you got Gujaratis, you got Hindis, so we got Iranians and Chinese, and then we also have a big heart for Arab speaking Muslims as well. And so I know that's still a really large target that we're going after, but we feel like, man, these are some of the biggest gaps and the biggest needs in the LA metro area.
And Kyle Pierson, thanks for hopping back on with us again. We had you guys who have listened to the podcast, all 7 of you who've listened to more than one. I heard whenever Kyle was joining us on the 5 T's, and man, just that training that we have kind of gone through has been just huge in helping us to really even engage in diaspora work and to start getting focused. I know you spent quite a bit of time recently with Tim. What were your takeaways from the LA Metro while you guys were together?
The biggest takeaway was, man, we're surprised with the lack of laborers here focused on UPGs. And it just really, my heart went out for Tim and his team. And, these guys are really working hard to get after it and doing a great job. And as, Tim and I and others were kind of asking around, like, who else is going after UPGs here? And like crickets. And we're like, God, how can that be? Because New York's obviously the number 1 as far as targets for unreached people groups in the United States. And there's a lot of focus on New York City. There's teams there, there's organizations there that have that focus on 2 or 3 targets of unreached people groups. And we just were not hearing that in the LA area. And that's not to say like we have all the knowledge. I mean, there may be people there, and we would love to know who they are if there are people.
If anybody who happens to run across this podcast says, hey, we'll put in the show notes some connections for Tim, so you can reach out and tell him we're here.
Yeah, hey, we're here. And so that was my biggest takeaway. I was shocked because typically when there's a gap that size in a city as important as Los Angeles, as far as global cities and how connected it is to the world, that it's that big of a gap in the United States. And so my takeaway is, hey, we got to put full steam behind seeing people groups engaged in the LA Metro.
So one more quick question. I know Mark got a bunch he wants to jump in on. Tim, where are you guys in the work? You've named about 4 or 5 focus areas. What does your team look like? What's the season that you're in? And what do you hope to, happen next with your rhythms? Just like, what does an everyday kind of on the ground look like for your team right now?
Yeah, great question. I think for us, at least the communities that we've lived in and have targeted, honestly, a lot of the work that we're doing is, we use the terminology 0 to 1 work. Like we're oftentimes the first believers, first group of Christians to engage these people, whether they're refugees or asylees, whether they're international students or just immigrants who have come here to work. And so a lot of our work is that 0 to 1, like getting the gospel to these people. And so like currently, as far as like what does team look like, we've got a couple of people who are focused here in Orange County on the work. A lot of times as we share the gospel, we're getting into discovery Bible studies, DBSs, which has been such a joy. Honestly, is opening up the word with someone for the first time, giving them a Bible in their language for the first time, and just seeing people explore who Jesus is man, it's just so impactful. I could just sit and just observe, what God is doing in that. And so, I'm not going to sit here and be like, man, we have, 50 generations of disciples amongst unreached people groups. We're just not there yet. We've seen some people come to Christ, and we've seen, a couple generations here and there. But I think for us specifically, as we're praying that God would raise up an insider in these people groups, that we would see an Afghan believer, arise, that we would see an Indian believer arise who knows the culture, who knows the language, who knows the people, and ultimately who has God's heart for the kingdom in their people groups. And so that's the big thing that we're praying for right now.
Our friend Bud, who's down there in the DFW area, he sent a couple of questions to ask you about as well. And obviously he's been real connected with this work that's happening here in diaspora in North America. But one of the things he asked that I think is a really good question is what are some of the biggest challenges for engaging these targets there in LA? Could you speak to some of those challenges?
Well, I think one challenge that we faced is, we're in a very transient culture. And a lot of these refugees who maybe that we're working with, they're very transient just because of what they've gone through. And so, maybe we get people for a season and then they move off to a new place. I think what's been cool is being connected with the No Place Left network and be able to pinpoint, hey, our friend is moving to Philadelphia. We're reaching out to people there. And so, I'm just so thankful that there is that network. But it is a challenge that we have, a very short time with people oftentimes. And these unreached people groups oftentimes take a long time to come to Christ, building that relationships with people. I think spiritually though, there is, man, the spirit of image here in Southern California is man, it just weighs in on the culture here, even these people who come from the poorest of poor countries or the wealthiest families. The culture or the spirit of image of making themselves achieve this American dream or achieve this status in life. We've seen that penetrate into the unreached people groups as well, which has been a challenge.
Hey, Kyle, I'd be curious too, after the time that you spent, like, what are some of the things that you're seeing that Tim's team is doing, or the work that is going on that you go, man, this is stuff that needs to be talked about to other teams, just as you observed it and you saw the things that they're doing that just encouraged you? I already know you mentioned a couple of that they're just working hard at it. We agree with you, Tim. Man, this process is hard. We had a gentleman on the podcast not long ago here in Oklahoma City named Kirk. And, he kind of got frustrated after 2.5 years of just working among the Vietnamese and laboring and laboring and laboring and laboring, just praying for an insider leader. Just a few months ago, God brought a guy actually from California to Oklahoma City that is an insider that actually just led 2 Vietnamese to Christ in the last week, because he's a guy who just knows the culture and those kind of things. So, I just want to encourage you in the sense that God will do that. But right now, Kyle, what did you see that you just go, man, this is something I pulled from the team that I'd like other people to be encouraged by and understand?
Yeah, I mean, I think they do team well. We the phrase that has been coined coming out of SoCal is mobbing. So they mob well. They travel well. They do things together. They mob in those areas where, in those geographic areas where work needs to start, like Little Arabia, Little India, and they're committed. They just hearing Tim's heart, he's like, man, I'm called here. I love it here, and God has us here in this season, and we want to press in. And so they're committed. They're focused. See where I'm headed here? So they're committed, they're focused, and they're consistent.
We like that CFC that's building here.
And they're consistent in their rhythms. They're meeting regularly for church. They're regularly in the harvest. Like Tim said, man, they're faithfully engaging folks with the gospel and getting into Discovery Bible studies. I mean, they were posting in the LA thread, just this week, 2 encounters where they're doing Discovery Bible studies with their target people. And I love the SoCal network, because they're just spiritually deep. They love spending time in the Word, spending time in prayer. They're fasting. They're just doing all the right things, all the right controllables that we preach, and they love Jesus, man. And
praise God.
That's we've got to put the sails up until the wind blows, and that's what they're doing. So I was stoked. I left there. I was like, man, I could work with these guys. Yeah. And they're fun too.
Kyle, from your perspective, I mean, I know that you're in DFW and your focus area is in there, but the Lord has blessed you with a season of life where you can help people in other areas. And what's your thoughts as far as someone who'd be a sender, or even someone who could help someone get from point A to point B to go and to engage in LA?
Yeah, I think that that's what it's going to take. I mean, I think there's going to have to be some mobilization into the area, as well as casting vision and training and mobilizing, in the target geography. But if there's anybody who's, just stirring in their heart right now, they feel like God is calling them to a place where there's great need. There is a stellar network in Southern California with great leaders and godly people who are humble and who just want to serve. And as you can hear Tim's heart, that, man, they're after the right things, and they're trustworthy people, and you would have a great community to do life with and labor with. There's a number of churches. I mean, there's some great fruit happening in Southern California among young people, among specifically Anglos, and there's churches multiplying. So there is a work of God happening, and so there's some momentum and there's some excitement. Seeing those unreached targets is the bullseye of the strategy. If we want to see the Great Commission accomplished in our lifetime, we've got to really be laser focused on praying and fasting. As Tim said, I mean, this is a spiritual work. Just being in it for 2 days, you're like, I can't do this. God's got to do something here. And the other thing too, it's not a bad place to live. I mean, the weather's perfect. and the sushi is amazing. But at the same time, it's kind of a hard place to live because, for one, it's expensive, and there is a spirit there, as Tim mentioned, and I've heard Troy Cooper call it a beautiful hell once, and there's a lot of temptation in a city like that, as New York City, same thing. So it does come with its challenges. The other thing I'll say too is there's a great history of Christianity in Southern California. I mean, the Jesus movement, Perspectives, Global Center for World Mission. I mean, all that stuff that had come out of the Los Angeles area and Pasadena and Southern California. You've got, Greg Laurie Calvary Church and all that. So there's a great foundation of the works of God in that area. And so I think there's some great foundation. We just need to see laborers pouring into that UPG
Amen.
gap.
I think part of this whole NPL experiment in North America has been this idea of movement to mobilization, that if we can engage and begin to see movement happen, that mobilization is going to happen. And I heard a stat recently from some guys who know that 200 that known people have felt the call to go and have God has mobilized and they've gone. And some of them are headed overseas. Tim, you felt called. Kyle, you're in a global city down in DFW. Dave, you're in OKC. I'm here in New York. Some are feeling called to go to a place like LA. I'd love for you guys to speak into, as God is beginning to move in people's hearts, make the case for that call to go to LA or a place in diaspora. Why should they process that, and why might God be calling them to there? What are the needs and the vision?
I think we could always roll out all of these statistics, 300 people groups and languages, 18 million people, 500 Buddhist temples, 300 Islamic centers. But the reality is people aren't going to remember that stuff. Like those aren't the things that stick with people. Oftentimes when people come out and take a trip, either to visit us or like on a mission trip, I always take them to one spot, and I take them to a cemetery. And you're like, man, that's so depressing. Why would you take them to a cemetery? But in this cemetery in our city is this huge cemetery, but they have this section called the Islamic Gardens, and there are just rows and rows and rows of these tombstones of Muslims who have passed away. I mean, just thousands and thousands of these tombstones. And if you look on the dates, of when these Muslims have passed away, it's all within like the last 10 years. And you're seeing these different names from Arab cultures, from Indian cultures. You see like some Malay Muslims who have passed away in our cities. But every time I go to this cemetery, I notice that the Muslim section, they're buying more and more land, because there are so many Muslims who are dying in our cities that they need more space. And so I was just scrolling on Facebook the other day and just saw that this Islamic society just bought this huge plot of land in a nearby city, specifically geared towards having a specific Muslim cemetery. And so I see this and I'm like, man, there are tens and tens of thousands of Muslims in our city who are dying and spending an eternity away from Jesus. And it's happening so fast that the Muslims are like, man, we don't even have enough space to bury these people right now. And so when I see that, I'm like, man, my heart breaks for that. My heart breaks that they're spending the eternity away from Jesus, that they've bought into a lie, that they haven't experienced true peace in their life before. And so I don't know. I use that as a vision casting tool of like, man, the need here is so big beyond what we can even compare.
So guys, thanks for joining us today. I hope that you feel provoked by what we shared about the needs and opportunities in what's happening out in LA. If you feel called to go or get involved or know somebody that maybe should know about this episode, please check out the show notes or pass along this episode to the right person who needs to hear it. Thanks, guys.